Hello and welcome to another episode of Conf42Cast, the tech podcast from a neighboring galaxy. My name is Miko Pawlikowski and I'll be your host. Today with me, I've got Kurt Andersen, the SRE architect at Blameless. How are you doing, Kurt?
I'm doing great, Miko. Thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure. So, a lot exciting ground to cover today, but before we even go there, what's the best thing about space travel?
As I was thinking about it, I think it's got to be the view. Once you get above the atmosphere, you can either look back and see those amazing views of Earth, or you can look out and really see the stars with no interference.
No light pollution at that stage.
Exactly.
Okay, so you sound like one of those people who would be keen to pay Jeff Bezos for a little trip. Is that right?
Well, I don't know if I'd want to pay his price.
Just a product. That's a very good answer. So I was very excited when I was kind of scanning your background because there's a lot to cover and it fits very nicely with our space-themed everything at Conf42. So I wanted to ask if you would like to give a quick introduction about yourself, and I would really like if the keywords like NASA and jet propulsion and IBM in the 90s came into play in that intro.
So I started my career working at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. I had the great experience of working in the image processing lab there and working on several missions. Some of the last Voyager images were coming through at the time I was there. The primary mission that I was involved in supporting was the Magellan radar mapping of Venus, because as you may know, Venus is covered with impenetrable clouds, so you can't actually see the surface. And the Magellan mission used radar, synthetic aperture radar, to look at the surface in greater detail than had ever been done before. I moved from there. I actually went to Hewlett-Packard and got experience supporting a manufacturing line with high volume production of inkjet pens. So that was a very interesting change in perspective. And then I went and worked for IBM's global consulting arm. They were divided at the time. They couldn't do managed services under the consent decree. So I worked at McDonnell Douglas supporting the infrastructure there at McDonnell Douglas and got to see a bunch of really fast planes up close, but lots of desks also. And then from there, I went back to Hewlett-Packard. I went back to the original test and measurement side of Hewlett-Packard after that, and really got involved in supporting engineers with a reliable platform that they could do their engineering work on, which is really the foundations of site reliability is giving a reliable platform to people to do whatever it is that the system is supposed to accomplish. I then moved over to their managed services arm and helped to build out and operate a major North American cable operator's new email platform and did the largest known migration of email accounts at the time. And then was hired by LinkedIn and got a whole new perspective on scale as we grew from about 200 million users when I started there to around 700 million when I left. So it was a great experience at LinkedIn. That's where I actually got the first title of SRE, although I'd been doing a lot of site reliability work before that. And then now I'm working at Blameless as a SRE architect to help build our product to help support SREs and everyone else who wants to deliver a reliable experience on their product.
That is one hell of a resume. I was actually at the Intrepid Museum in New York a couple of weeks ago. I was just staring at the space shuttle and thinking, gee, this is so cool. This is just like a dream job to be working on that kind of thing. But I think I'm detecting like one kind of recurring theme in all of that was the reliability aspect and scaling it up, right? And you got all the right names on your resume from NASA to IBM to LinkedIn to Blameless now. So I was wondering, you would probably you mentioned LinkedIn was the first time when you actually got an SRE title. So could you talk to me a little bit about, from your perspective for the last few decades, how this evolved into what we call today SRE, and maybe even how you define SRE like in 2022?
As you may know, the moniker of SRE was coined by Google in the early 2000s. I wrote a small report from O'Reilly called "What is SRE?" intended to kind of fill in the gaps for management people who wanted to know more about this profession. And it was kept as a relatively closed in-house secret at Google, but of course, Silicon Valley leaks people between different companies. So other companies in the Valley started doing this thing because they saw that it was part of Google's secret sauce, if you like,
Right.
and how they managed to make a something that worked at scale and met people's needs. It kind of SRE became a little bit more official with, of course, the Google book, the SRE book coming out in 2016, I believe it was, maybe 2015.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, site reliability engineering, and then followed by the workbook. And Google has, fortunately, I've had the opportunity to work with a lot of folks at Google and formerly at Google, and they've recognized that raising the level of performance and quality across the industry helps everybody, including themselves. And so it's not something that they should hoard to themselves, but they've become very much more open, I'll say, over the last 5 years in terms of sharing content. And you can look at sre.google, I believe, is their link. And they've got all kinds of resources out there now, from some of the workshops that they've taught. They built them internally, and then they've taught them at SRECon conferences and other venues. So people can go there and learn some of these skills and learn some of these patterns of systems thinking that were not previously easily taught or learned. And they're not taught in schools particularly.
So before, we all learned from Google to call it SRE, what were you calling that, doing that job at the previous places?
Well, it didn't really have a recognized title. It was something along the lines of, it might have been a systems engineer. It could have been a sysadmin. It could have been just a developer who happened to focus a little bit more on how the systems performed in production, as opposed to just what features can I ship. And there's a convergence, in a sense, between the DevOps movement that was launched, if you like, around 2010, in that having both sides work together and recognizing that, hey, if there's a hole in the boat, it doesn't matter whose side of the boat it's on, the boat still sinks. Yeah. So we have to work together in order to bring everybody together and make a successful product. I guess online delivery of software and the cloud to some extent, but just online software and the web really changed things compared to putting it in a box and sitting it on a shelf somewhere.
Or sending it to space, right?
Or sending it into space. That's right. Yeah. And of course, when you're sending software into space, you really want to make sure you get it right, because you often don't get a chance to do it a second time.
That's right. So that was one of my questions I was going to ask you about, was like, we all speak about reliability, but obviously it's a different thing when you can roll out a new version in 15 minutes and fix an outage that affects people not being able to show off their new job. It's a very different kind of experience when you have satellites and rockets exploding and people dying potentially. So I was wondering, how different was it thinking about reliability at the different, points of your career, and whether there were things that were the same and what was, the most different?
I would say the time scale is really one of the biggest differences, because when we were working on missions at JPL, we were planning for things that were going to be 5, 10, 20 years in the future. And we were going through doing risk analysis prospectively, what is called today like a pre-mortem, for example. but we were considering things on a huge timescale. It's like, okay, in 10 years, what radio reception capabilities can we count on to be available in order to listen to this thing that we have sent out into space? And can we count on 24-hour coverage? How do we minimize any data loss that might occur on these, I'll say, amazingly low bandwidth connections, essentially, that we have from the spacecraft? And today, when you think about, as you say, you roll out a new version, you fix it, you commit it, you ship it into production, and it's 5 or 15 minutes. You don't have that level of planning. You probably don't necessarily need that level of planning, but you still need the ability to think ahead. And so it's time scale is the biggest difference.
A little bit of a side question, but I'm wondering, when you get together with your old friends from NASA, how often do you talk about SpaceX and what they're doing? I mean, you mentioned you're on the Starlink link, which seems to be working reasonably well. What's the opinion? Because I know initially it wasn't necessarily very well received, but at this stage, from like someone completely outside, it appears to be more or less accepted. What's the prevailing feeling about that?
Well, I don't actually haven't bumped into any of my colleagues from that long ago recently, but I do know that there's some concern in the astronomical community as to pollution in their fields of view from Earth, with the proliferation of satellite constellations around the world. I'd say, since I live in a rural area and had middling performance from a broadband connection until I switched over to Starlink, it's been a huge improvement on my end. But that's, of course, looking at it from a selfish perspective. So
that's right. Yeah. I mean, we're first experiencing for the first time this kind of mass satellite installation in the orbit, and I'm pretty sure we'll find out interesting things about the side effects of that at some point, sooner or later.
Undoubtedly. And of course, there were previous attempts at similar things like the Iridium systems for sat phones, which ended up not panning out financially. So it'll be interesting to see over time how Starlink works out financially and technically.
One question that I'm very curious about is, from your perspective, where do you see SRE evolving and going in the maybe medium to longer term? And for everybody else who hasn't had a chance to speak to Kurt, he forgot to actually mention his involvement in the Usenix and the SREcon, which he's been a committee co-chair a number of times, right? So he's sitting and has a very nice view of where things are going. So if you were to try to distill what your best guess is of where that might be going next, what would that be?
Well, I think that in some ways, SRE as a practice will become a little bit more diffused into the gestalt of software. I'm not going to limit it to development, but just overall software. I think that some of the tooling is becoming much more accessible. You get a bunch of stuff today out of the box if you go and use any of the major cloud providers, which 5 years ago or more would have had to have been built at considerable expense and expertise in-house. So by making this tooling available for everyone, and especially I'm thinking of platforms, observability platforms, they really change the capability for the, I hate to use the word average developer, for every developer, I'll put it that way, to get in and see how their software performs in production. Now, there's still a mindset that they have to care about that, but at least they have the capability now with some of these observability platforms that they was always locked away behind special tooling before. So I think to a certain degree, SRE will become a niche profession. In some ways, it's kind of like running your own email server, for example. 40 years ago, everybody did it. Well, not everybody, but lots of people ran their own email servers 40, 30 years ago. It was not any big thing. Today, if you talk to somebody and they say they run their own email server, most people would look at them a little sideways and say, well, why would you ever do that? Now, there is a core of people who are experts and they spend all their time thinking and sleeping and drinking and eating email. And and they run things like Yahoo's email platform and Google's email platform and Microsoft's email platform, or some of the smaller ones, like the privacy oriented ones of Fastmail or Proton Mail, things like that. But it's a vanishingly small number of people doing that, similar to agriculture. If you look at how many people 100 years ago were involved in agriculture, it was a significant percentage. And now that has shrunk over time to a smaller and smaller number of people who can then still generate huge yields out of the land. But it's a very small number of people who are directly involved in agriculture anymore. I think in some ways, SRE will be a similar thing. There will be a core set of people and skills in a smaller group of people, but it'll become democratized for more developers to be involved in the more common aspects of reliability.
So are you saying that the tools for SRE related work that we have now are becoming the harvester and the tractor and the heavy machinery, and that allowed for the specialization and for a very small sliver of the population to be involved in growing crops?
Yes, I would say so.
Right. Yeah, I think that definitely aligns with a lot of the stuff that I'm hearing from other people. But there's also the question of, you kind of alluded to that before, the mindset part of it, right? We've got the tools that keep getting better, but you need that mindset of building things with the reliability in your mind. I'm wondering if that is not like a bigger hurdle in the long term than just the tooling. What's your opinion?
That is a tremendous hurdle. You've put your finger exactly on it. And I don't have a strong answer for that. We see it amongst the SRECon community, the participants, that it is really difficult for people to get into the field. There are no good kind of educational on-ramps to systems thinking. And it's a conversation that's occurring, is the best I can say. Nobody, as far as I know, feels like they have the answer to the problem. And even within companies that maybe are relatively new to digitally enabled services, everyone thinks in terms of the features because they're the things that people see. They're the knobs on the dashboard in a sense. But they don't necessarily think about the maintenance and the support that goes on behind the scenes in order to make sure that those knobs and features work the way they're supposed to and give customers the experience they want. And it's different people are car salesmen than the people who are mechanics, for example, to steal another analogy.
Where does Blameless come into that? Is it more on the tools side of things? Is it more on the culture and mindset side of things? What problem are you solving? And why are you at Blameless?
we actually straddle that tension, which is an interesting place to be. Our goal is to provide tooling that makes it easier for people to handle incidents, both before the incident occurs, during and after an incident, so that you can become more effective at responding to problems, because problems will always occur. If you have an efficient response to problems, then you can reduce their scope and reduce their duration and make a better experience for your customers. Our goal is, John Allspaw and the folks at Adaptive Capacity Labs talk about this above the line and below the line divide. Above the line is where the people are, and below the line are the computer systems that do their things, and we have to infer about that. Our goal at Blameless is to build tooling for the people side to help the people be effective and efficient in responding to incidents, not to do, say, the observability side that would be probing the contents of the computer systems.
So how is that different from like the competitors and the other tools that I guess you could assemble a similar thing? What's the unique selling point for Blameless?
From our point of view, providing this lifespan of an incident, both before, during, and after an incident perspective, is where we think the right answer is. And so in terms of before an incident occurs, we have support for SLOs and error budgets. During an incident, we've got the incident management framework and support for chatbots that will collect all the events that are going on for you. And then after, we facilitate a retrospective or a postmortem or an incident review or whatever you care to call it in order to learn from what went on before and during the incident. So that trans incident perspective is our unique offering.
Do you wish you had that back at, I don't know, your HP days or your IBM days or NASA days?
Oh, yes. Yes, indeed. I recall many of the challenges that we had managing incidents when we were doing that email system, because we were a contract managed service, so we also had to integrate with the company itself and make sure that lines of communications were always working well. And that was always a challenge, was having the good communication going on. Slack wasn't around at that time either, which made it a little bit harder too.
That's true. Well, you can't work without Slack apparently anymore. That's the rules. So for everybody who wants to get started with Blameless, where do they go? What do they do? What's the least resistance path to give it a try?
The best way to go is to go to our blameless.com website. And we've got all kinds of materials there that you can read about SRE. You can read about incident management. And we've got several ebooks that I'll provide links for you to put in the show notes. And there's a give it a try button. I believe it's at the top of the website. And you can click that. And one of our awesome folks will get back to you immediately or really soon and work with you to set something up for you to give it a spin.
So that's great. For everybody who needs to pause the show and go check it out, when you're back, what I'm going to do is try to extract 2 nuggets of wisdom from Kurt. And the first question is, what would be your advice to someone, early in their software engineering or SRE career for the next big thing, obviously? It could be a skill, a technology, a language, methodology, whatever you think is going to become increasingly important and useful in kind of like the mid-term perspective. If you had to pick just one thing, what would you recommend?
I think that I would say the most important thing is to develop the skill of empathy. Being able to put yourself in the shoes of your customer or the developer, looking at problems from their point of view or a variety of points of view, and being able to communicate that I think that would be the key. That would be the killer app, so to speak, or the killer skill to develop.
Wow, that is such a human response. I have not had this one before. Empathy. Yeah, I think we all could use some more of that on both receiving and giving ends. And that kind of ruins the second question for me, because I was going to ask you now, what's the highest return on investment thing that you've done for your own career, looking back? Would you say that was the empathy?
Yeah, it's the empathy, and it's also probably as far as some specific thing that I did that I found great benefit from was joining Toastmasters and improving my public speaking skills.
I never actually tried Toastmasters.
You should give it a try. They've got a pretty solid program, and it's surprising. People think about public speaking as in going to a conference and speaking. But if you're in a meeting with 10 people, that's also public speaking. So it comes in handy in all kinds of scenarios.
That's right. So be empathetic and learn how to speak publicly. the most useful technical skills that we recommend here. Kurt, how do people find you? Do they go to LinkedIn? Do they find you on Twitter? What's the best way to kind of follow your adventures?
I think probably LinkedIn. I got to say LinkedIn, since I work there, is would be my preference. I'm not hugely active on Twitter. I do have an account there, but on LinkedIn is probably the best place to follow. And I also write periodically for our blog at Blameless, so I try to cross-post links there as I come up with them.
Sounds great. And with that, thanks for coming on the show. Hopefully,
thank you,
we'll
Miko. It was a lot of fun.
Another time.